Tension in Steven Spielberg's classic film Jaws reaches a height when Robert Shaw's character tells of being in shark-infested waters after the 1945 sinking of the USS Indianapolis. Was this chilling monologue based on a true story? Yes. The USS Indianapolis was a battle-scarred veteran of World War II's Pacific Front. The ship's last major action was to bombard Okinawa on March 1945, and after taking damage, withdrew to the naval yard at Mares Island near San Francisco. It was there that Captain Charles B. McVay III received secret orders to carry a small load of cargo to the island of Tinian. The chief medical officer reported McVay saying, "I can't tell you what the mission is. I don't know myself, but I've been told that every day we take off the trip is a day off the war." The Indy made the 5,000 nautical mile crossing to Tinian in 10 days, arriving on July 26, 1945. McVay and the crew of the Indy later learned that they had delivered components of the first atomic bombs, Little Boy, which leveled Hiroshima, and Fat Man, which destroyed Nagasaki. After Tinian, the Indy made for Guam, then left for the Philippines. They were about halfway there when a Japanese submarine sighted them. It was a little after midnight on July 30th, 1945, when two torpedoes sliced through the ocean en route to their target. The torpedoes slammed into the USS Indianapolis's bow and amidships, and this made short work of the veteran cruiser. It only took 12 minutes to sink, slipping to its tomb 18,044 feet below the surface. Some 300 of the 1,195 crew were killed immediately. These may have been the lucky ones. Those that lived clawed for life vests and cut out as many of the ship's life rafts as possible. Some scrambled down the ship's sides, and others jumped into the sea, which was glossed with a thick veneer of fuel oil. According to a recount by Captain Lewis L. Haynes, chief medical officer on board the ship, the crew leapt into the muck of oil sloshing in the seawater before swimming away hard to escape being sucked down with the ship. It was chaotic and confusing. There were hardly enough life rafts. The vast majority of men bobbed like corks covered with fuel and oil. They formed a long, dirty string that stretched over the open ocean for a mile or more. They prayed for rescue. For the USS Indianapolis, no rescue was forthcoming. According to an official account by the Navy, distress messages had been sent but were not received. In fact, on July 31, 1945, the naval staff at Leyte removed the USS Indianapolis from its arrival board. This was a standard practice during World War II, when combat ships were assumed to have arrived on time unless other information became available. In this instance, the naval officers who knew the ship was overdue did not investigate why. Another failure occurred when naval intelligence received information that the Japanese had sunk something in the area where the Indianapolis was expected to be. Their lack of interest was explained by the Navy. Through the course of the war, there had been numerous instances of fake claims or fake intelligence made by Japanese forces. It meant that naval intelligence looked skeptically at Japanese reports, and when information about the incident was shared with top brass, they chose to disregard it. If the survivors of the USS Indianapolis knew that naval headquarters were not aware of their disappearance, they may have lost hope then and there. Still, the 900 men clung to the thought of rescue, but they were swimming in a nightmare of epic proportions. The first trouble was exposure. At first, the fuel oil from the wreck acted as a crude sunscreen, but the survivors soon drifted into clear waters that provided no shelter from the sun. Men's skin burned by the day, and then, although the tropical water is warm, it's still colder than human body temperature. At night, especially, life was slowly sucked away as some of the crew succumbed to hypothermia. This grew worse as hours stretched to days. Those particularly at risk were those who had sustained injuries when the ship initially sank. The chief medical officer Haynes later recalled, "There was nothing I could do but give advice, bury the dead, save life jackets, and try to keep the men from drinking the salt water when we drifted out of the fuel oil." With hardly any fresh water to speak of, the men were sorely tempted to drink the salt water. Those who did fell victim to salt poisoning. Men hallucinated, seeing the ship beneath them full of food and water. They thrashed about desperately and drank even more salt water, thinking it would cure their thirst.
The first couple of days, those guys never lasted very long.
It is estimated that up to 150 of the USS Indianapolis's crew were killed by sharks. While at first the sharks largely concentrated on the dead, by at least the second day, the living were targeted. Injuries and open wounds spilled blood into the water, and more sharks came to feast. To ward off the sharks, the crews took to pushing out the dead bodies, hoping that by sacrificing them to the sharks, they'd be left alone. They organized shark watches when they noticed that the animals tended to attack those survivors who floated alone. So they gathered into large groups. When a shark approached, the men beat at it to drive it away. Those in the center of a group fared best. Survivor Edgar Harrell recalled, "You see maybe a body up on an 8-foot swell, and all of a sudden that swell breaks, and that body comes down and he hits you, and he leaves parts and residue on you. You see that and you wonder, is that going to be me tomorrow or yet today?" Another survivor, Clarence Hirschberger, only saw 1 or 2 sharks, but recalled, "But you knew they were there because somebody would let out a blood-curdling scream like you never heard before, and you knew someone had been hit, usually on the outer edge of the group." And in 2017, another survivor summed it up like this.
How I got through this, I really don't know. I just damn lucky, that's all there is to it.
So what species of shark attacked the crew of the USS Indianapolis? National Geographic says that the great white shark is statistically the most dangerous shark, along with bull and tiger sharks. However, in the case of the Indianapolis, the main culprits were oceanic whitetips. The oceanic whitetips primarily range in the open ocean far from humans, but they are considered potentially dangerous to people. They're often seen in waters around boating disasters, and it's an aggressive species that shows little fear. Once plentiful throughout the world's oceans, the oceanic whitetip has become the victim of bycatch and rising demand for shark fins. It is estimated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that the species has declined between 80% and 95% in the Pacific since the 1990s. In 2018, the species was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The crew of the USS Indianapolis would not have cared about what species of shark was attacking. To them, it was a continuous nightmare, as some of the crew slipped into madness when signs of rescue failed to materialize. By their second night in the water, men's minds broke from lack of hydration and food, witnessing the continuous death of their shipmates and the terror of the sharks.
Shark comes the nearest man, that man he start pounding and hollering and screaming. Sometimes the shark would go away. Sometimes he wouldn't.
By the morning of August 3, 1945, there were a little over 300 crew of the USS Indianapolis left. The only solace was in prayer. But that morning, things changed as a Navy PB-1 Ventura piloted by Wilbur Chuck Gwynn flew over the disaster area on a routine patrol. He was cruising at 3,000 feet and had a 20-mile view of the blue Pacific about him. He was far too high and at too odd an angle to see what was going on below him. However, the plane's antenna had broken. Gwynn turned over the controls to investigate, which brought him to the bottom of the plane. There was a window on the deck through which he saw, to his utter amazement, an oil slick. After tracing it, he found the survivors and radioed for help. By that evening, rescue craft had arrived in full force and evacuated the victims. Search operations continued until August 8, 1945.
You can never forget that. I mean, I've never forgotten it.
Of the 1,194 crew, only 316 survived. In the immediate aftermath, a court of inquiry recommended Captain Charles B. McVay III be court-martialed. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz disagreed and issued a letter of reprimand to McVay instead. However, according to the U.S. Naval Institute, Chief of Naval Operations Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King overruled him and ordered a court-martial. There's been speculation that motivations involved much more than simply the Indianapolis disaster, and McVay found himself at the mercy of the courts. December 3rd to 19th, 1945 became the only time during World War II that a skipper was tried for losing his vessel. According to the records, he was charged with failing to issue orders to properly abandon the ship and for failing to take proper zigzagging evasive maneuvers to avoid submarines. At the trial, the commander of the Japanese sub that sank the Indianapolis even appeared to give testimony, stating that zigzagging would not have saved the ship. Still, McVay was acquitted on the first charge and found guilty of the second. He lost a chunk of his seniority, which was later restored by Navy Secretary James Forrestal. McVay retired in 1949 as a Rear Admiral, but the blame of the disaster was firmly fixed on his shoulders. The psychological toll on the crew was devastating. It would be fair to say, however, that McVay bore the brunt of it. To the families of some of the victims, McVay was being let off too lightly for the deaths of 879 husbands, fathers, and sons. The surviving crew of the Indianapolis supported him, and McVay attended their first reunion in 1960. But the shadow and evidently guilt of the disaster never left him. On November 6, 1968, at noon, McVay shot and killed himself outside of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut. After McVay's death, the survivors of the USS Indianapolis wanted justice and exoneration for their captain. It seemed clear then that McVay had been a scapegoat. Yet the effort to exonerate McVay didn't really begin until Hunter Scott, a middle school student, interviewed survivors of the disaster in the 1990s for a class project. This caught the attention of congressmen. In 1999, the veterans of the Indy pressed for and received a hearing with the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, where they shared Scott's considerable research. They pressed for full exoneration. This cause was further supported by a letter from the then 90-year-old Mochitsuru Hashimoto to Senator John Warner. He wrote, "Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war. Perhaps it is time your peoples forgave Captain McVeigh for the humiliation of his unjust conviction." Warner introduced a resolution in 2000 to exonerate McVeigh. This passed, as well as a stronger version in the House of Representatives. The final version noted, "Captain McVeigh's conviction was a miscarriage of justice that led to his unjust humiliation and damage to his naval career. And the American people should now recognize Captain McVeigh's lack of culpability for the tragic loss of the USS Indianapolis and the lives of the men who died as a result of her sinking." Over the years, the survivors of the USS Indianapolis have had regular reunions. At first, it was once every 5 years, but as more and more crew passed, they decided to make it an annual affair held in the city for which their ship was named.
I don't know what made me so lucky. Those guys died right by me.
These reunions include a memorial service for those who were lost at the sinking and to honor the USS Indianapolis veterans who have passed. This group, aside from their advocacy for their captain, were also instrumental in the commissioning of a memorial to their lost shipmates. Dedicated in 1995, the memorial includes a replica of the vessel and a piece of the USS Arizona, connecting the first and one of the last ships sunk in World War II. The living memory of one of America's greatest naval tragedies will not last much longer, but it's safe to say that the sacrifices of the crew of the USS Indianapolis will be forever etched into naval history. As of January 2022, only 3 crewmen are still alive. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK.